Okay, well, we are right on 6:30, so let's start. I'm going to start the way I normally do and basically ask if there's anything in particular. I want to finish off the agreement topic before we move into consideration. But if there's anything in particular about agreement that you want to talk about, actually, before I do that, I'm going to ask if we cannot talk about the memo and the assignment task today, because we're going to spend a lot of time in tomorrow's class, and the recording comes out of tomorrow's class, talking about how to format a memo and how to approach the problem task. So I really would like to just make sure that we're all finished up on agreement and that we're as comfortable as we can be with the agreement topics. So I'll start with you and ask you what you want to talk about, and then we can move from there, because I can always talk about anything, really.
I personally haven't had a deep look at the second week's discussion problem. Is that a grounds for discussion or not really, considering there's...
Let's see what other people want to do. I'd probably rather not talk about the week by week discussion problems, but we could maybe pick one of the other exercises that's in the materials, have a look at how you might approach that just from a problem point of view. Largely because, so as everybody who did the discussion problems, has everybody seen the feedback that I've given?
Yep.
So, and well, hopefully that's useful. I'm happy to pull together some general statements that you might like to think about in relation to the next ones. So why don't we do that to start off with? There is an art to answering these legal problems, and practicing using IRAC is a really useful way to start. I think, as I mentioned in class a couple of times, that when we think about IRAC, where we start off is by identifying the issues. And to do that, there are kind of two important elements. One is, on one side, drawing from the facts what's material and which of the facts are relevant to the issues that we're looking at. That's the space where you might need to make some assumptions. So just going back to the problem that you did last week, right? Because I'd like to leave this week's open for people who, a number of people have done them already, and really for you to have a play with. But if we think about last week's, if we think about Zita and Susanna again, there are a whole heap of facts there. Now, one of the facts said that there was an email, and I think it might have even used the word containing an offer. So a number of people, when they were responding to that particular problem, they went straight to an offer's been made. So again, articulating exactly what you're saying there would have helped those people. So if you said, well, I'm going to assume that a legal offer has been made because that's what the facts have been given say. So, and what that means is I am going to assume that there was a statement capable of acceptance on its terms, which, if accepted before it was withdrawn, would have created a contract. Having said that, it would have been reasonable to say that there was a pet shop involved, and in most circumstances where we have a vendor selling something, there is likely to be an invitation to treat, then it would be worth actually saying, if that assumption is incorrect and it's only an invitation to treat, then my analysis will need to take a different turn. So first, we've got a material fact, then the issue is it an offer or not? Now, some people went straight to an assumption, yes, it's an offer. But in order to actually identify, is it an offer or not, you actually need to do a little bit more work. So why do I care whether it's an offer or not? A number of people went straight to, well, the issue is working out whether this offer has been accepted, and then stopped at that point. Articulating why an issue is important takes everybody to the next step. So really what the issue was here, if we had to point down to one thing, is whether or not, I'm going to get the parties incorrect now, so I'm going to say the cat purchaser, the person who wanted to purchase the cat, I think that was Zeta, whether or not Zeta was a party to a contract, because if she was a party to a contract, she would have some rights to enforce that contract. I mean, in order to work out whether she was a party to a contract or not, we need to know whether a contract was formed. The elements for formation of a contract are agreement, which comprises offer and acceptance, or, as we now know from last week, some kind of consensus. It also encompasses consideration, which for the time being we will call price, certainty and intention to enter into a legal relationship. Now, this early on, the problem was framed, so it was really a problem about offer and acceptance. And as is the way of these things, actually the offer and acceptance didn't match, so you didn't need to explore the other elements. That tends to happen in these kind of problems, and you can draw from that what you will. Be careful about being too strategic about it, that's all. So thinking back to it, we had material facts, so identifying what was material in the problem, how it related to the issue, then why the issue is important was really how you do well in the issues section. Now, again, for these little things, I'm perfectly happy for you to set them out as issue, rule, apply the rule, conclusion. It's not a silly way to set it out at all. Certainly makes it easy for me to mark because, as you can see, the rubric's there and I can just match them across and it's easy peasy. Again, though, sorry, is somebody asking a question or is that? Right, Aisha, I'm going to mute you, my love. Just for a second. Happy to see you, but I just unmute if you need to ask a question. So I'm happy for you to set it out that way. But then the fifth criteria is how you write. So you're writing in presentation. The best ones, the ones that get 4 or 4.5 out of 5, and it's a very rough measure. I mean, as you can probably guess, 2.5 is pass. 3 is a credit, 3.5 is a distinction, 4 is a high distinction. So, you know, you can sort of see what you get for each of those elements and they add up. It's a very rough measure. And again, for those of you who are doing them in the OUA group and your best 5 marks will count, you will find that it actually really doesn't matter terribly much over 5% what marks you get. Because if you do them, you're going to get somewhere between 2.5 and probably 4.5 at the maximum for those extra marks. They're not going to make a significant difference to your overall mark. It's about the feedback as much as anything. And those lovely people in face-to-face, you're literally just doing it for the feedback. Which I hope is useful to you. And I can tell you that there is a direct correlation in the past between students who do them and exam performance. So they're worth doing from that point of view. But if you look at the feedback that I'll give you in relation to the presentation, it's quite hard to get good feedback or a high mark in relation to the way you've written it when you slavishly adopt the formula, because it doesn't flow as a narrative neatly. So thinking about that. So then when you go to what the rules are, probably the biggest piece of feedback I could give everyone, and frankly, I think there were only a couple of students who did this really well, is if you state a rule, support it with a citation. Primary sources beat secondary sources. So a primary source in the context of legal advice is a case. Secondary source is a peer-reviewed journal article or your textbook. If you are referring to your textbook only, you're 2 steps away from just providing the case name. So when you provide the case name, provide the citation with it. Now, in an exam, you won't need to provide the whole citation, but I want you to practice. And if I don't point that out to you when you do an assignment in the next couple of weeks, and then you're just putting case names in without the citation, you'll be cross with me because I haven't given you feedback to put the citation in. You can put the citation in one of 2 ways. You can do it entirely in text, which means you will have the case name in italics, and then the citation, which is invariably year, if there's a volume number, the volume number, the journal code, and then the page. If you are doing a really good job, you will then pinpoint. So if you're quoting from something, you will actually then have a comma and then the page number on which the actual quotation or the actual part of the judgment you're referring to comes from. Okay, I'm not going to crucify you if you don't pinpoint, but the better students, when I'm looking at ways that you can improve, that's often a comment that I will make. So if you really want to push for it, that is definitely something that you can do. So citation needs to be formatted properly too, which means it's not normally in italics. You can either have it all in text, or you can put a footnote next to the case name and you can put the citation down below in the footnotes. Trick for young players, particularly those of you who are coming from one of the business or humanities referencing sections, you're used to putting the author name and the year in brackets. So what I often see is case names with the year in the text and then the rest of the citation in the footnote. Does that make sense to you? Stop it making sense to you. Case name, year goes into the footnotes, or you have the year and the rest of the citation in text. Again, often putting the year and the rest of the citation in the footnote, that actually aids readability. Do you know what the best way to learn how to cite is? Look at how the citations and the footnotes work in your textbook. Now, there has been a slight update. So this text would have been put together using AGLC 3. We've now got AGLC 4. But in relation to the kinds of things we're talking about, those differences are absolutely minimal. And where in your longer assignment it'll make the biggest difference is just the way that above N and in particular, and also citing online sources. But let's worry about those things in a couple of days. Using your textbook as a kind of model for how to write is a really good idea. Now, don't copy what's in your textbook point blank, really, but think about the way that it's laid out. Think about the use of headings. Think about the way that there are footnotes, or how it uses footnotes, how it cites the cases. Observe how often the first time the case will appear in full, and then subsequently they might refer to just Carl Hill or carbolic smoke ball or something like that. What other things stood out? So not explaining why the issue was important, not necessarily thinking about the material facts. The people who did best had clearly sort of worked through a timeline of what order the things happened, and had thought about what the impact was of the things happening in that order, and what were relevant and what were irrelevant facts in relation to that. The really good, strong ones, and I mean, they're different canvas shells, so clearly you can't see them all. But if you did it, you get the benefit of being able to see what other people did as well. So take some time to have a look at how other ones were different from yours, and you'll see some of the better ones had a really clear conclusion. And often that conclusion is reflected, and actually I didn't see that this much in this lot from memory, but it's a good idea when you start giving advice to actually just be really clear what the answer is up front. So, you know, dear Zeta, unfortunately I don't think, or it's highly unlikely that you have any basis to make a claim in relation to the purported contract with Susanna. the reason for this is blah, blah, blah. Finish with the conclusion again. And when you say something in the conclusion that's different from the logic that's come above, then that's quite difficult. A couple of them were very long too. I mean, there's a bit of an art to just being concise, but then a number of them were probably too short, didn't have enough depth in them as well. Deep breath. Is that useful as an overview for thinking about how to approach the next one? Because it's also useful for you thinking about how to approach the more serious problem that you have to deal with, which for the OUA people is worth 15% and for you face-to-face folk is worth 20%. But you all have the same problem, by the way. Okay. So in relation to agreement, any particular issues that you want to have a talk about?
I was wondering if we can go over the idea of the conflict of battling forms and the synthesis of them.
Okay, the conflict of the battle of the forms. Let me bring up actually, let me just find the right slide first. Let me bring up the slides and we can talk about it in this context. So, battle of the forms. Okay, and then I'm going to share my screen. Okay, excuse me if I look down occasionally. I've got a massive screen in front of me there and a tiny little one down here, and I've got to remember to look at the camera and I forget. So there are two kinds of circumstances where we end up with a problem where we can't match the offer and acceptance easily. I think I mentioned that when I was at university, we talked about the elements as being offer, acceptance that is communicated, consideration, intention, certainty. But subsequently, the two ideas of offer and acceptance have effectively been merged into this one idea of agreement, because particularly in Australia since the Brambles decision, we have this idea that provided we can demonstrate consensus, that we have agreement, and that it's a legal fiction to assume that there is always a clear acceptance matched by, clear offer that's matched by an acceptance. But so there are two types of circumstance where that arises. So the Brambles type circumstance, and the other circumstance is what we call the battle of the forms. That term comes from some language from Lord Denning in the case of Excello and Butler Corp. Might be Butler Tool and Excello. I can't remember the order of the divisions. So the kind of circumstance we're talking about there is actually commercially completely understandable. You're talking about a situation where a company might use purchase orders for purchasing goods or supplies. So a purchase order is basically their document that they state is the terms and conditions on which they will purchase from suppliers. So all of us have heard about, or all of us have probably seen that situation from time to time. I'm not sure who's got a siren out their window, but would they mind muting? Thank you. Think of a situation. So Woolworths, massive grocery store. It buys apples, or actually one you've probably seen in the news over and over again. They buy milk. So they buy milk from dairy farmers, and whether they buy it directly or they buy it through cooperatives, it really depends. But what they do is they provide a purchase order that says, Mr. Dairy Farmer, I assume the dairy farmer's a male. That's really, let's go Mrs. Dairy Farmer. We will purchase milk from you. We will purchase it at a rate of, I don't know what the farm gate price is, let's call it 33 cents a litre. You must supply us with X number of litres over the next Y number of months. It has to be of a particular quality, and stipulates all of these different terms and conditions. Now, if I go to buy milk from the farm gate, well, let's say I'm buying it from Murray Goulburn, which is a large cooperative. If I go to buy that milk, there will be an invitation to treat. So, and that invitation to treat will be accompanied with some terms and conditions. And the terms might be that the price is 75 cents a litre, and that they won't be responsible for the quality, and that they can't promise what time it is. In fact, they might even include terms and conditions that say if I want to purchase at the 75 cents a litre price, that I have to commit to purchasing a certain number of litres. So can you see how the terms and conditions from the purchase order might be very different from the terms and conditions that are associated with the invitation to treat? So a battle of the forms case is when there's never actually been a discussion or a meeting of the minds on what the actual terms are, but the parties have corresponded, they have transacted with each other based on these overlapping forms. A purchase order comes through, there's a delivery, often which the delivery is associated with another set of terms and conditions that have to be signed on acceptance of the goods. So in Butler Tools, there was a dispute over what the terms of the contract were, and each party was saying our form is the form that we use. Our form represents the terms and conditions. That other form has nothing to do with us. So, and so it was Justice Denning who coined the phrase a battle of the forms, like which form wins. And effectively he said, and I'll just throw the quote here, and I will need to put my glasses on to be able to read it. There we go. The better way is to look at all the documents passing between the parties and glean from them or from the conduct of the parties. Now that's the important part, from the way the parties behaved, whether they've reached an agreement on all the material points, even though there might be differences between the forms and the conditions printed on the back of them. So in a battle of the forms case, and so the transaction that I just described, purchasing milk, ultimately the question of price is going to go to what have the parties actually done? What price has actually been paid? Has there been an ongoing dispute in relation to it? If there has, maybe that would be addressed in the way that it was addressed in Match and Paul and Penol, the case that we discussed in class last week. But ultimately, if we can see that there has been agreement in relation to the material terms based on the consensus and the activities of the parties, then the courts can find that even though there's no clear offer and no matching acceptance, communicated or otherwise, that there is an example of conduct where the parties have actually created agreement and we've got evidence of consensus. And that gets taken, or actually, well, just so the questions that were asked in Butler are these kinds of questions: whether there was an agreement, when and where that was made, and again, we need to look at consensus and the activities of the parties to determine that, and then how do we respond to the contradictions? Now, in an ideal world, nobody wants a court to try and work out what the commercial terms are. So our job as lawyers, effectively, is to make sure, as much as we are able to, that those disputes can be eradicated, that we can have clarity on what the terms are. And so that might, learning from these kind of cases, involve advising a client that if they don't like the terms in the purchase order, then they shouldn't supply the goods without clarifying what the points are. because there is a significant risk for your client if they supply the goods and they accept payment for them, that a court would find that their conduct supports the idea that the terms and conditions are the terms and conditions in the purchase order. Similarly, if you're acting for the party who wants to purchase the goods, to the extent that the invitation to treat or the tender or the documents that are put forward by the vendor of those goods is inconsistent with the terms that your client wants to trade on, that acting otherwise could create significant issues for the client. So there is value in reading and understanding the contracts up front. So is that helpful in relation to Battle of the Tools in particular? Battle of the Tools, Battle of the Forms. Sometimes they are.
I was wondering, does that battle only apply to contracts themselves flowing from one part to another, or does it also cover where there might be a back and forth of offers and counter offers and whether slight variations to those?
Well, I think that we don't have forms involved necessarily in that. That's the next step, which is the Brambles type situation.
Right, okay.
So the Brambles situation takes this battles of the form idea to the next step. So let's go on and have a talk about that. So Justice Hayden's decision is what was relevant here. So in Brambles and the Bathurst City Council, what you had was a situation where Brambles provided services for a period of time. And that was a fixed contract that was going to cut out at a point in time. And prior to the end of the contract term, they then tendered to continue to provide these wastewater treatment services. They also pitched that there should be an increase in the price. The City Council, I should say, said that they would agree to an increase in the price. In fact, I think they proposed a higher price, but they said that they should get to keep most of that increased price. So there was cents per litre or megalitre, I can't remember now, for the treatment of this wastewater. So that went through, and the council said, so the council provides wastewater treatment services. They do that by contracting a third party to do it. They pay the third party. And so there is this, in fact, I actually think the people who are using the water treatment facilities paid Brambles, and then Brambles would pay a proportion, like a levy, back to the City Council, is my memory. But I will freely admit that all of you should have read that case much more recently than I have. So if I've messed up the facts slightly, firstly, I don't think it matters for the illustration purpose, but feel free to correct me. And so they collected this extra money, and then the council saying, well, you need to pay us this extra amount. And Brambles is saying, no, we never agreed to do that. But in this case, Justice Hayden provided a test for where there was no clear offer and acceptance, but there had been toing and froing in the negotiation. So what he said is, when no offer and acceptance can be identified, it's relevant to ask whether an agreement can be inferred. So inferred as opposed to implied. So again, those two words, just a little sidetrack here, inferred and implied, make sure you're using the right one when you're analysing cases, because people get them back to front all the time and they mean the opposite of each other.
Kath, could you clarify that now?
So if I'm doing this, I might be implying that I relate to the cat over there, and me doing that, you see it and you infer from my movement that I'm a complete idiot. Or that I'm trying to relate to the cat over there. So implying is the thing that the person does when they give you some but not all of the information. You infer something, you draw a conclusion from their conduct. So if you were to read two cases, you would infer that the law was blah, blah, blah based on those two cases. You would never imply it. Unless, of course, you were a Chief Justice or the author of one of those cases, which I'm guessing none of you are. But if you are, I'm apologising for my skills at teaching your subject. So where no offer and acceptance can be identified, it's relevant to ask whether an agreement can be inferred, whether mutual assent has been manifested, and whether a reasonable person in the position of each of the parties would think that there was a concluded bargain. So again, we don't use a subjective test, we use an objective test. Can we infer from what the parties have done, which includes after the contract has been made, whether or not there is an agreement? So conduct after the point of the alleged agreement being made is only really relevant for the purpose of working out whether we can understand or infer from the conduct of the parties that the parties assumed there was some kind of bargain. If subjectively they still hadn't agreed and they were expecting to sort it out later, that doesn't matter. The test is, could a reasonable person infer from their conduct that a bargain had been met? So the textbook does a really good job, I think, of explaining this, and I'm, at risk each time of picking up the textbook and just reading it out loud to you, but I'm sure that you can do that and better yourself with your own highlighters at this stage. Have a look at the test. So basically we start with what's happened. Can an agreement be inferred? And from that, can we see that there's mutual assent? So can we see that there is a consensus, that the parties objectively looking, we don't care what they actually think, what we care about is what we see. Would you be able to infer that there was a mutuality, that it's not just one party enforcing the rules? And as a consequence of those things, would a reasonable person come to the conclusion that a bargain had been struck? And if we have all of that, then we have an agreement, even though we can't point to an offer or an acceptance. And even though most of the cases you see, most of the time where this will come into issue, you'll be grappling with, is there an offer and is there an acceptance or not? Again, think back to, why do these cases come to court at all? One party wants a court to agree that either there was no contract at all, or the contract is different from the contract that somebody's trying to enforce against them, or that they want to enforce, they want to get a higher payment. They can't do that on the terms that are in front of them. They're needing to actually bring evidence that the agreement is something different from what's in front of us. In most cases dealing with contract law, you will find that we skip straight ahead to what the dispute over the contract is, because the parties will just agree that there is a contract. Trying to demonstrate that there is no contract is usually a way of getting out of a contract. So actually, so basically this is probably worth mentioning, these two tests. And I would always go first to, is there an offer? Is there an offer at all? Is there something that is capable of being accepted on its terms? If there isn't, then we can skip straight to the second test. But if there is, the next question becomes, was it in fact accepted without any variation before it was withdrawn? If the answer to any of those, so it was withdrawn first, then something else happened, or there was a variation, let's say withdrawn first, you might go on to the if this fails test. If there was a variation, then that's a counter offer. So the counter offer, was the counter offer accepted? If you can't see clear acceptance, then you might go to the consensus, look at the behaviour of the parties. But going back to our trigger question in the beginning, Zita and Susanna, one of the things that we see there is that, well, Susanna's sold the cat to somebody else. So we cannot infer from her conduct that she thought there was an agreement in place. So that test would fail as well. So just while we're here, it's probably a list of takeaways towards the end of that slide pack that are worth having a look at. And particularly as you're going through your first assignment question, you might want to just use it as a bit of a checklist for thinking about, have I identified all of the issues? Have I addressed them? So thinking about, so these are the kinds of things that you need to know by the time you get to the exam at least. Unilateral and bilateral contract. Again, I only want to know about that if it's relevant to the question at hand. When's it going to be relevant? When we're looking at whether or not there was a contract that was created because of somebody's conduct. Do we have a unilateral contract that means that performance has been fulfilled by the other party and that all we're waiting for is for the offeror to make good on the offer that they made? You need to understand what constitutes an offer. You need to know the difference between an offer and other kinds of similar or conduct that looks like offers but might not be, like an invitation to treat, like a request for information. You need to understand the difference between a conditional offer and an option. So an offer that will only come through if a condition is in fact met. So I will offer to buy all of you a drink if you pass this course. You can take me up on that offer when the condition is met, if I don't withdraw it in the meantime. Actually, you've got this evidence. I will make good on that offer. You could pay some consideration to turn that into an option so that I can't withdraw it between now and the time that the results are released. So understanding the difference between a conditional offer and an option, understanding that an option itself is a separate kind of contract, and that in order to hold somebody to the promise that they will keep an offer open for a period of time, that in fact needs to be a binding contract. So we need agreement, we need consideration, we need certainty, and we need intention for it to be a legal relationship. You need to be able to identify what is acceptance. When is silence going to be enough? Spoiler alert, hardly ever, but in the kinds of situations like Empinol, where there would be, it's not just silence, there is also acting in accordance with arrangements, acting in accordance with the contract even though it hadn't been signed. That was more than silence in that case. How is acceptance communicated? What are the rules for communication? Again, this risk of a spoiler alert here, the place you can get yourself tied up in knots really easily is in the postal acceptance rule, which is less and less and less relevant because these days most of our communications are instantaneous communications, and instantaneous communications work the way that they have always worked. The communication is deemed to occur at the time and in the place where it's first capable of being received by the recipient. That's supported by the Electronic Transactions Act. Postal acceptance rule, on the other hand, deems communications to happen at the time and in the place where they are put in the post. It's an exception to the general rule. We've already spoken about effective counter offers, and then also understanding when we apply our consensus rule. So when the Brambles rule might apply. Few more slides here. I'm not going to go through them line by line here. I don't think that's particularly helpful. But unless you have questions in relation to them. Actually, one we didn't talk about is that acceptance can't be retrospective. Does anybody want to have a go at understanding what that means or articulating what that means? I just feel like I've been talking a lot and my tea's getting cold.
Well, retrospective means it comes after the fact. So just, I guess once offer's been withdrawn, or like once it's lapsed a certain time, you can't necessarily go back and try and accept it.
Absolutely. So basically, an acceptance happens when and where it's communicated. You can't communicate and say, I accepted that offer last week. You can accept it only at the time and at the place that you communicate it. And so again, if only going to be relevant if it's been withdrawn or the circumstances have changed in some way. So you can't try and trump it by saying, oh, subjectively, I meant to do that. Feldhaus and Bindley is a really good example of that, where that was the case where the uncle sent a telegram, I think, saying he wanted to buy a particular horse, and he would, if he didn't hear anything more, he would assume his offer had been accepted. And then later on, the nephew saying, oh, well, I meant to accept that. I even told the auctioneer to keep the horse aside. But the question became, just, you can't do that later. You can't say, I accepted it. You actually have to physically communicate that acceptance. It's actually much more straightforward than I suspect it appears to start off with. You will become much more familiar with this stuff. It's just getting your head into the way that the courts have recognised these rules over time, which are all aimed at getting consistency in the way that commercial transactions work. Anything else in there? Key takeaways here. I've got heading in the middle. So why don't we end by just having a look at the flow chart here, which is just worth remembering at the beginning. And one of the things that I'd suggest that you do is, as you're pulling together your notes in relation to each of the topics, is taking these flow charts or developing your own, adding to them notes of which cases support each element, and think about the process as you work through, because you'll often find that this kind of flow chart will help you as you need to identify, well, what's really the issue here? And again, identifying the issue, you might say, well, the issue in this case is whether or not there was an offer. The reason that's important is if there is no offer, then there's nothing that's capable of being accepted, and we don't have a contract. Therefore, Zeta has no claim in relation to the cat, or Kath has no claim in relation to the carton of wine, or whatever the case might be. So again, start to think about the ways that you would answer these, and there is an art to it. You need to say enough that a stranger, a legally informed stranger, could understand what your point was, but you don't need to summarise the whole of the law of contract. A piece of advice that I give people over and over again is read each sentence, or at least each paragraph, and ask yourself, does this paragraph aid my reader in understanding what the answer is to this question and these facts? If the answer to that is no, fabulous. Cut and paste this paragraph and put it into my notes for later, because it will help me with my revision and might be useful in an exam. And then revise it to be very specific about how it applies to this particular case. Make the word count by making every word count. For a tutorial, I feel like I am doing way too much talking.
Kath, I did have one question.
Right.
About the carton of wine. No. Where you have a flow chart of offer, these are the questions, and then acceptance, these are the questions or tests that relate to each of those, what look like separate elements, where there is conduct between the two parties such that a party who was originally the offeree may, over the course of negotiations, turn into the offeror, and vice versa for the other party. When assessing their actions, do we need to just group all of party A's conduct together and say whether there was offer and or acceptance, and then move on to party B's conduct? Or do you switch between the timeline of their conduct instead?
You're asking me for a formula to how to answer a question, which is not a stupid thing to ask for, but it would be a really stupid thing for me to give you, because there is not going to be a one size fits all. You have to go through that process, but there's an iceberg element here. What I need to see is the iceberg, the bit that floats on the top of the water. In order for it to float and make sense as a nice pithy memorandum, you're going to have to do all of this work that sits underneath to support it. And you are going to have to flow through each of the facts, and you're going to, I would always recommend putting a timeline together and working out what's relevant and what's not relevant. I'm a big fan of doing it with post-it notes, because you can have a different coloured post-it note for each party. You can move them around and you can sort of see how the flow fits together, and then you can pull that together. It depends on who you're advising, what the question you've been asked is, but you're going to have to do that work. You're going to have to work through party A. What did they do? What was that response? Classify everything. I mean, we're constantly classifying things, aren't we? You know, is it a bilateral or unilateral contract? Is that an offer? If it was an offer, was it accepted, or was there a counter offer? What does it mean when a counter offer is made? So that offer, that particular stream in the flowchart is now cut off. What if they're still prepared to deal with that offer? What does that mean? So again, just moving through each of them, it's messy, but you've got to do that work under the water in order to then articulate something clearly. Another piece of advice I give really often is do that work and then tell somebody what the answer is. Somebody who's not a lawyer, who's not another student. Tell your dog if you need to. Use a different part of your brain and just actually articulate it out loud. Record it into your phone and then play it back, because that will help you see whether or not what you're saying makes sense and stands alone. Like, does your bit of the iceberg float naturally above the water and help your reader understand what the answer to the question is? Sorry, I know that's a frustrating answer in its own way, but you know, if you really wanted a course where you could get it right or wrong, that there was only one way of doing it, you'd be studying something completely different. And for some of you, maybe it's not too late. Don't leave me. Any other questions, concerns, frustrations?
Kath, I was just wondering, we're talking a lot about agreements here, and I've been reading through the consideration notes. Is that, I'm in the right week, aren't I?
Yeah. Well, we're at, as far as I'm concerned for the Tute, we are at the end of week 3. We start week 4 tomorrow. Right. Yes, and frustratingly, you need to have done quite a lot of reading by 6:30 tomorrow night if you are a face-to-face student and you're coming to class. If you are either not coming to class or you are an OUA student, you need to have that reading done before you get the lecture tomorrow. As always, I promise that you will get the lectures within 48 hours of the class, and I think you probably will have seen that they're usually within 24 hours. But I'm only promising 48 hours because I would rather under-promise and over-deliver. Yeah. So, but for what it's worth, I'm not super busy Tuesday morning, so barring technical hitches, you should have them, you know, by Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, all good. I accidentally read, I think, a week ahead.
No,
that's fine.
It's all right to keep reading. It's good. And look, what you'll find too, we're very slow at the beginning because we necessarily keep bumping into the later areas. So because an offer, just even an offer, needs to contain everything. It needs to contain the DNA of the contract, which means it needs to articulate what the consideration will be. Now, you've been reading about what consideration is, hopefully. So we'll be ready to start talking about that tomorrow. But we'll be reading about what the consideration is. And so the offer will contain the consideration. It will contain some kind of evidence of what the terms will be. There needs to be some sort of certainty, even if it's just reacting to an invitation to treat. And so we're necessarily sort of bumping up against those things, and then we'll move faster when we get further along. So, we spend 2 weeks on agreement, 2 weeks on consideration, and then we start to fly. So, all right, well, it's 7:20. Unless there are more questions, and I'm very happy to address them, I'm going to suggest that we all go and have a little lie down because I'm exhausted. And I suspect many of you did intro intensive this weekend, some of you on the back of a negotiation intensive last weekend, and I know many of you have full-time jobs, so I don't want to just keep you for the sake of keeping you. You've got to look after yourselves here. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And like I said, I ran a half marathon this morning and I can barely stand up. So you're doing a marathon every week. So look after yourselves.
Okay, thanks, Kath.
Thanks, Kath.
See you later, people.
Thank you.